and then to start.
Okay. Okay, good morning, everybody. I wish I could see you all in person, but we're here virtually. Welcome.
It's not working. It says the live event hasn't started. Oh, there, wait, it's spinning. Okay, now you're on.
Okay, I think we're on. Good morning, everybody. I wish we could see each other in person, but it's great to be connected to each of you virtually. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules. This early Monday, March 28th, a little cold out, but spring is here. And so super excited that the weather is changing soon. Today, we have a phenomenal speaker and a great opportunity to talk about strengthening our community and confronting hate speech by building understanding and empathy. And so if you've watched the news these last couple of weeks, and many of you have probably witnessed even in your own schools, just the uptick in level of hate speech. We're wrestling with this as a nation. We're wrestling with this as a state. We're wrestling with this as a county, and then we also wrestle in our individual schools. And so we thought it important to take a pause and to talk a little bit today. This is the beginning of future conversations. This isn't a check the box. This is not a one and done. This is an opportunity for us as students to come together and talk about the things that really impact our community. I'm Dr. Jason Otley, the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer here at Arlington Public Schools. And so this event is one of many in order to strengthen our community and to bring us together as we discuss things that are equitable. Our guest speaker, Dr. Todd Mealy, who is joining us today. He's a 20-year public school educator. He's also an adjunct professor in the history department at Dickinson College. Dr. Mealy primarily works in the areas of history and race, civil rights, and sports culture. Dr. Mealy received his PhD in American Studies with a focus on race and society from Penn State University. He is the author and editor of 9 different books. His next book, The N-Word in Music in American History, a history of racial slurs in across musical genres dating back to the Civil Era, will be published this May. Dr. Mealy is currently working on the authorized biography of Jane Elliott, educator and creator of Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes Exercise. Dr. Mealy, super excited about the next 40 minutes that we have with you as you discuss a conversation on hate speech, history, culture, and a school-centered solution. Let me get out of the way and introduce and bring in Dr. Todd Mealy.
Dr. Otley, thank you. And thanks everybody for coming to my live talk, or if you catch this recording later. It's a presentation titled Discussion on Hate Speech, History, Culture, and a School-Centered Solution. And I've been looking forward to this day to talk about my thoughts on what can and can't be done on hate speech. And I want to do that through an interdisciplinary lens. One that's as a historian on American history who has written on the topic as it relates to music, and also as an educator, as Dr. Otley mentioned, for 2 decades. So what I'm going to do here is share my screen. Just give me a moment to do that. And okay. So as I mentioned, I want to provide everybody with something to think about as you walk away here that might be able to apply to, Arlington Public School. Now, I also feel that owing to my studies on the topic, that if you grow up in the United States, you're aware of slurs, speeches that incite. No one, in my view, is unaware of the topic, no matter your skin color or cultural background. You can't escape violent language really anywhere in our society. So to that end, I believe hate speech is a conversation that all people should have. And I understand today we're not really going to have time for questions, but I don't know if anyone at the end of the talk today will say that. Feel free to write down questions, and then they'll just be sent to me, and then I will respond to everybody in due time on whatever questions they send me. So here's where I want to start, and I want to get right to it largely because of time. a definition on hate speech. So I don't think we can move forward without talking about contextually how we define this. And to paraphrase what I have on the screen, it's really any kind of pejorative slur or language that's used, imagery, graffiti that's used to incite or create division. And so back in early February, pictures of several white students from a school district in New York spelling out the N-word with their bodies went viral on social media. The pictures were actually part of a group text. Someone took a screenshot of the group text and then they posted the pictures of the students online. Not to mention that this was during Black History Month, but that incident, as it was passed around social media, was followed by calls from parents and students for the school district to address not just that incident, but to address existing racist behavior that occurred throughout the school district. And the students at the school even conducted a sit-in to demonstrate unity and a call for a school building investigation into hate speech among the student body for years. And parents showed up at school board meetings expressing a pattern of unaddressed name calling, racialized bullying that their children had endured. The school then spent the next month putting together a plan to create a, quote, safe and inclusive environment. In the 4 or 5 weeks since, these well-meaning district leaders have tried to address the issue. They faced different arguments about how to tackle the problem of discriminatory behavior, but then also the proliferation or the increased use of racial slurs. And so when stepping in to address hate speech, they've been challenged to address the casual use of words like the N-word or Q-word as it applies to the LGBTQ community, or the R-word as it applies to those with disabilities. This is a complicated problem, which is why I use this as really my hook to the talk. These school district officials up in New York, they're now challenged to address one contextual usage of hate speech which is used to harm a person, but they're also challenged by a different group to address another contextual uses of words that's typically deemed as hate speech but used in a manner of speaking to one another in an endearing form. So in other words, there is a redemptive or ironic use of terms in order to mock an oppressive system. And so here's the question that looms in any school age controversy. Why should schools address one contextual usage while ignoring the other? And I think that's the problem, or that's why programs like this one are arranged by your district leader. So these questions, they plague public schools in different ways. And quite often, just this spring, stories about dealing with hate graffiti have occurred in schools ranging from Missouri to Florida to Philadelphia, where I am here in Pennsylvania. These incidents occur in classrooms, restrooms, locker rooms, on the internet, on athletic fields. They occur at football games. They occur in student sections of basketball games. So just a few weeks ago, the Anti-Defamation League, they published its annual report on hate incidents. And they showed that almost 5,000 hate speech incidents were reported in 2021. Which amounts to about 13 reported incidents a day. Now, this report, what it does is it tracks the spreading of racist and anti-Semitic and Islamophobic and anti-LGBTQ signage and graffiti. And so while the entire report was disturbing, I was even more shocked to see that in my state, Pennsylvania, it led the country in the highest level of hate speech. Your state, Virginia, came in second. So as I dig into this presentation, there's two problems. As I mentioned, that your school leaders and those like the school up in New York are currently facing. One problem is the problem of increased hate speech used to harm, degrade, libel others, which is perpetuated by bigoted people in positions of power and influence. The other problem is the increase in the use of slurs that are traditionally considered hate speech, but used in endearing ways to speak to friends. And that kind of speech is commonly signaled as okay by social influencers in music, film, and other forms of popular culture. So these are two dilemmas that I'd like to make you think about today, and then your school community will discuss in the days ahead. So I think what I may say here might surprise some. It's going to please others. Some may not even understand my argument. But my hope in any event is to give you a voice from which to glean solutions for Arlington Public Schools, and it's as Dr. Otley mentioned, its quest to deal with hurtful language. So my argument is centered on this question: why should Arlington Public School leaders fight hate speech with more speech? With that question in mind, and accepting the idea that, unfortunately, even violent, racist, or homophobic or ableist comments are protected speech by the Constitution, an answer to mitigate or decrease expressions of hate, in my view, is kind of like this five-pronged approach that I have here on the pyramid. Now, it might sound clumsy, but my answer to hate speech is anti-hate speech, or a form of love speech that's designed to protect vulnerable groups and vulnerable people. It's a discourse that values and respects social differences. And so here's how we get there. So I'm giving you the solution ahead of my argument. So there's 5 things here. The first, as you work up the pyramid, is a model of education that reaches the elementary level, the secondary level, but then also the educators. I'll speak more on that toward the end of my talk. The second tier is a renewed commitment to tackle the issue of bullying. The third is finding ways to unite student interests in a collaborative or a student, teacher, and administrative coalition that pressures one another to treat each other better and to treat your school better. The fourth is to level power. That'll take some time to explain, and that's the bulk of the historical part that I'm gonna provide here. And the fifth, as I mentioned, is more speech. So what I think is this 5-tiered approach can actually harness or cultivate empathy and sympathy in the school system, while also enabling teachers to continue to teach, their skill-based standards by the Virginia Department of Education. And so I'd like to use 3 lenses to present my case here. The first is the historical lens, the second is the cultural lens, and then I'll get into the legal or the politics around this. And so I want to use the historical argument and the cultural argument to expose how people, the public, become susceptible to prejudiced ideas, and then they become emboldened to behave in discriminatory ways that pose threats to people of outgroups. And then with whatever time I have left, I'll talk a little bit about my understanding of how the law has worked in and out of schools. And I'll combine these 3 points of view to offer up a plan for Arlington Public Schools to discuss. So let me begin with history. And my examples will touch on blackface minstrelsy, the Holocaust, the murder of a gay college student at the turn of the century, and the characterization of wartime foes. When I'm done, I'm going to ask a question. Now, clearly it's going to be rhetorical because of this setting, but the question is going to be how responsible are government institutions, which include public schools or even social influencers like teachers, celebrities, and authority figures like deans of students or principals, how responsible are they in creating an environment where so many bigoted words have become so pervasive? So if you're not familiar with blackface minstrelsy, it's a form of theater or entertainment when people, mostly white, some black, blacken skin with burnt cork in order to entertain white audiences with demeaning representations of black people. Throughout the 19th and almost 3/4 of the 20th century, minstrelsy was a major part of the entertainment industry. To advertise minstrelsy, the N-word became the universal phrase. The performance art itself was characterized by the slur. So the singers or the troops were called the N-word trio or N-word quartet based on how many singers were in the group. The music then helped normalize the racial slur in general society and in individual behavior. The N-word leaped off the plantation and into popular music, as minstrelsy was America's first original music genre. So meaning that the slur became normal, became casual, as it was used to describe clothing and house pets in creeks, mountains, carnival games, even children's songs. But more, these performances were done during the time when most black people lived in the South. It was before the Great Migration. 90% of the black population was in the South. So minstrelsy was a performance done by white people, for white people, and for white people that had never interacted with a black person before. Some of our most cherished animated characters, even like Mickey Mouse and some Looney Tunes episodes, are based on blackface performances. So man, imagine the influence that minstrelsy had on disseminating stereotypes and causing certain racial presumptions to manifest in the use of slurs and other ugly words pretty naturally. And even today, we sometimes see it on TV or read about it with stories on college campuses around Halloween time. Let me return to that in a second. The second case here is the Holocaust. So the systematic slaughter of about 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe in a 12-year time period. The Holocaust began as an attempt to humiliate Jews, to convince them to leave Germany. And then humiliation didn't work the way that the hate propaganda, the objective, the Nazi government enforced segregation by forcing Jews to wear the Star of David on their clothing, and then relocating the Jewish population into either ghettos or labor camps before the war. When America entered World War II, then the Nazis created death camps, and hardly anyone in that part of Europe batted an eye. The purges and executions of Jews were conducted by ordinary people, and many were school teachers like me. So how does one get to the point where they can take part in a heinous action like death squads of World War II? I'll return to that in a second. A generation ago, when I was in college, when Dr. Otley was in college, a lot of your teachers, there was the murder of a gay student in Wyoming. And I don't think most students on the call have heard of the 1998 murder of Matthew Shepard, but I think the educators have. And so Shepard was an 18-year-old student at the University of Wyoming. He was killed in Laramie in an anti-gay hate crime. He was beaten, left tied to a fence for almost 2 days. Shepard's death generated a number of studies in 2005 about the experiences of LGBTQ students. They surveyed upward to close to 50 gay-straight alliances in schools across the country. And you see these statistics at the time in 2005, 92% said that they heard homophobic remarks frequently. At school, 83% said they had been verbally harassed. 61% said they didn't feel safe at school because of their sexual orientation. 34% reported physical harassment. Not shown here on the slide, but also included in this same study, was that 75% said that teachers never or rarely intervened when homophobic remarks were made in their presence. This slide shows you a generation later, largely your generation. And what you see here is that these numbers haven't changed all that much within roughly a 15-year time period. In 2009, this national climate study showed that 99% of all students heard the word gay used in a negative connotation, that they heard homophobic remarks frequently at school. The number of verbal harassment just ticked down slightly. The number of those who don't feel safe at school ticked down just a few points. And the number of physical harassment also showed a slight decline after 15 years. It should make us all think about how the Don't Say Gay bill recently passed in Florida won't help the confidence, self-esteem, or level of curricular or extracurricular engagement of LGBTQ students. And I'm going to wait for a report to come out whether there's an uptick in hate speech toward LGBTQ students in Florida by the end of 2022. So with that, I'll kind of return to my question. What do we do to get to a point where thoughts and language about people of outgroups is so ugly and even violent? And what responsibility should we level on authority figures for emboldening hate speech and hate crimes? If we were together, that would be something we would discuss. But for now, what I want you to see is that in each case that I presented, there's a numbing effect. Minstrelsy, whether on stage or the big or small screen, this causes impressionable minds to believe that this kind of characterization is normal. Government propaganda and government behavior, like in Nazi Germany, emboldened people into thinking a targeted group of people is worthy of mistreatment. Even a school system that refuses to acknowledge that a certain group of people are in fact people leads to devaluation and detachment and violence. So my point here is that there is this emboldening of bigoted behavior that comes from power. And then it also has a consequence that results in destroying self-esteem and a sense of self-worth. I call it a dialectical bigotry. And so what I mean by dialectic is that there's a communication culture that exists between authority and people of influence, and how their actions or statements influence the general public. This dialectic can take the form of both words and actions, and sometimes inactions too. Most certainly laws can also do the same thing. And so those messages are you have value, you don't have value, or even they don't have value. And so here's even another example. You take a look at World War II propaganda against Japanese and Japanese descent people in the United States. You know, I think this propaganda put Americans in a place that numbed them to the treatment of Japanese Americans. We interned 120,000 Japanese American citizens into camps from 1942 to 45. Even those who fought in the war in return were placed in camps. The Supreme Court ruled that those camps were constitutional for the time period. A small protest movement existed, but that could hardly gain any traction. And then we dropped 2 atomic bombs on civilian targets in Japanese cities and hardly batted an eye. You see on this graph that 85% of the public supported the use of the atomic bombs in the way that we use them. This dialectic of anti-Japanese propaganda numbed the public and allowed us to run racial slurs about Japanese people in our headlines, which got the public to a point of not thinking about the lives of Japanese and Japanese Americans. How does that translate into our current moment? You all might recall that 1 year ago, quite literally, several different organizations released statistics about the rise of hate crimes against Asian Americans. One report included the New York City Police Department that showed something like a 1,900% increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans in the second half of 2020. Now, if you dig into that report, that number increases from 1 to 20 hate crimes in the city. But then the following year, 2021, the number of hate crimes against Asian Americans increased to somewhere more than 130 hate crimes. Plus, reports in larger cities across the United States showed similar numbers. And the FBI released a report in February 2021 about what showing a 73% increase in anti-Asian hate crime that took place in 6 months of the year 2020. So all of that warranted the Stop Asian Hate movement. And each report suggested that people of influence, like politicians and some celebrities and members of the media who were calling the virus Chinese virus or Kung flu, led to an increase in hate speech on social media. The report showing the uptick of millions within just a couple days of posts that were deemed as hate speech towards Asian Americans. Now, this comes in many different forms. As Dr. Otley mentioned, I've been writing about this in music, but that's one problem. Hate speech that's aimed at hurting. It's generated by a dialectic culture of communication. Let me take a moment to address the second problem that surfaced in that New York school that I opened with. Words are commonly thought of as hate speech that now used in casual conversations. The most common reaction in my studies are that words are a generational problem. Okay, so things like the N-word or the F-word or Q-word, you know, those and other slurs amongst Jews or Asians and such, these have actually plagued every generation. So I'm pushing back that this is new to the current generation. It's been around. If you look back in records, you'll even find Frederick Douglass writing about the N-word's use in a positive or a redemptive context. I say this because it's disingenuous to blame the use of these casual words, ugly words, as a problem originating with the current generation. What surfaced in my studies on hate speech and racial slurs, and that I'd like to ask you to think about, is that there's an argument over words spoken in what we call in the family. So the idea that oppressed people can say slurs commonly used against them because by willfully saying them to a friend, it takes the bite out of what was once historically, in many ways, currently used to incite violence. That argument, I think, is compelling, and I see the merit behind it. But school leaders, like the ones in the New York example, and I'm sure those in Arlington Public Schools are dealing with, is that there's still a problem, and that problem is cultural and social. So here's something to think about. What do we do? Now, you can make this part of your conversations in the future. But what do we do when white folks grow up in a social, cultural environment where such language is common, but it's a natural element of life and they have not been afforded the chance to learn about history of insightful terms. That's their lived experience. It might not be ours or mine or the educators here, but it's theirs. So what do we make of that? The second is, what do we do when we take popular culture or music or movies and those words go global? And all of a sudden you have people all the way over in, say, Vietnam or Saudi Arabia who hear derogatory words or variations of derogatory terms in those forms of entertainment, and then are now using them casually. This is what makes the discourse and decision making about hate speech so frustrating and difficult, particularly within the family argument. Now, I want to move to, in the time that I have, solutions. And so I'm going to jump ahead here and ask the question about what extent should teaching, sorry about that, multicultural empathy be prioritized, and how does that look different at various levels of education? And if I may, what power do school leaders have in ending hate speech? And should that be a challenge taken up by the students? So let's see what hasn't worked. And I think bans, wholesale bans on ugly words, they haven't worked. There's a lot of examples, but because of time, let me give you a couple. Okay. As I mentioned, the New York City Council in 2007 tried to ban the word from the city. This citywide edict was a reaction to the increase in the use of words in rap lyrics. The action had no impact on the city or within the city. During that summer of the same year, at a national conference in Detroit, the NAACP held a mock funeral of the N-word. And during the ceremony, speakers decried musical artists and comedians to stop using such words. A couple years ago, in 2014, the NFL created a rule that penalized players for saying the N-word during a game. It was a ban that penalized the person 15 yards and then was ejected after the second time it was used. That overly punished black football players while no whites were punished. And then in 2017, in my state, Socon Valley School District, its school board had passed a district-wide ban on 5 words that it deemed excessively offensive. Immediately after, they took a public poll and it showed 65% of the district opposed the board's policy. And then they figured out within a month that there would be lawsuits to come over free speech. So they rescinded the ban. So here's the thing. Hate speech bans have been tried time and again, and they've typically failed. And what bans in history or our current moment ever work out in the end? If you've ever heard of the phrase, the cure is worse than the disease, that might be how we approach this. Why? Because defining hate speech is largely subjective. One person's hate speech could be another's love speech, for lack of a better phrase. So for instance, within the last 2 years, we've seen debate over even expressions of Black Lives Matter, and some deeming that as hate speech. You know, being blamed for spurring the murders of police officers, even called a terrorist movement by some pundits. In the past, symbolic expressions like the Black Power salute, which expresses racial solidarity, people have called to ban that, claiming it expresses racial superiority. I mean, there were times that some charged the civil rights demonstrations of the 60s were hate speech. Imagine some of those, the protest movements on campus or Selma or other places would have been shut down if the power proclaimed that is hate speech. And so this is why I say it's almost impossible to make decisions about free speech objectively. And that's whether we're talking about symbols, something like the Confederate flag or rainbow patches. And so that brings me to the educational mission. And so I want to go here to this pyramid and talk about this in the last 9 minutes that I have. I've created this 5-tiered strategy depicting in this pyramid framework for fighting a school-centered hate speech, come up with a solution for that. And the point isn't for Arlington public school teachers or administrators to do everything themselves. to confront it, you need a whole APS strategy to fight intolerance. And this framework is a mixture of ideas. It's offered by the Anti-Defamation League. Some of the ideas generate from that organization, which largely establishes initiatives against anti-Semitic speech and crimes. Also generating some solutions coming from the ACLU, which has an honest and genuine approach of supporting free speech, no matter who the claimant is. And then a few years ago, the United Nations pushed out an initiative or a strategy against hate speech. So I merged them together because they've never been tried all at once, and they clearly have never been tried in a school setting. So let me move up the pyramid. The first tier is focusing on education. And here's how I think education should tackle the issue. At all levels, there should be some form of restorative system on language. And so this goes against more of the popular movement to fire or suspend or altogether cancel people. But I think in general, the idea of educational equity is about giving people second chances. So this would allow the contextual evaluation of understanding difference between saying an ugly word, which means that a person can be reformed in a non-corporal way, versus the wielding of a word, which will take some stern punishment if the intent was in fact to harm emotionally or physically. In this system, this restorative system on language, there's a component of programming that older students should go into the elementary schools to work with children on discussions on this topic, but then also children's books readings that value diversity, that value clean language, and then discuss ways to filter the language, because those kids are going to hear it in popular culture and they're going to hear it from their surrounding peers. So this restorative system on language is a good way to mitigate the frequency of hate speech by ensuring diverse representation of literature that children encounter. And for even students of a dominant culture, that exposure could and should break stereotypes before it develops in their mind. The curricular content, in other words, conveys more positive information about traditionally marginalized groups. It helps people move beyond stereotypes and their social interactions. So that's the elementary level. At the secondary level, I would argue a deeper commitment to civics education, because civics education, understanding the multicultural, multiracial dream of the United States and how a democracy is supposed to work. And so I think an emphasis placed on civics education and humanities can get students, secondary students, to a point where they're more conscious of hurtful language. And then part of that is also to work with the educators, work with the classroom teachers. You know, what about when language appears in a textbook? Do you think students should be in discussion with their teachers about this? I've noticed the social studies department at APS, it has a statement online about what teachers will do when encountering a racial slur in the text. I think that's a great approach. You know, but you get into ideas about microaggressions. So teachers are aware that saying the word in class just because it's part of a text can be harmful. Okay, so that is the educational piece. Moving up a level, we're now looking at anti-bullying efforts in the district. One of the places that I've studied is New Jersey. New Jersey has a harassment, intimidation, and bullying law. It was passed more than 10 years ago. And that action requires districts to adopt practices that implement reporting investigations into incident of harassment or intimidation or bullying in schools, on school buses, and even online. So I think a deeper commitment to anti-bullying can handle a lot of the things that are protected in First Amendment when educators are trying to think of solutions on dealing with hate speech. The third tier I call coalition building. And here you enable student groups, so school clubs, Gay Straight Alliance, affinity groups, even sports teams, to work together to identify any issues that surface, and then give the students and these student groups, these leaders, the responsibility of protecting one another. These coalitions can find slurs written in bathrooms, they can take pictures of it, report it, and then today they can remove it. And they can also pressure one another. You know, they can hold one another accountable, and they can help root out stereotyping and labeling. and altogether hate speech that occurs both on the right and the left. So with that said, we get to the fourth tier of the pyramid, which is about identifying, exposing that dialectical intolerance that I talked about earlier. This is an idea or an effort to level power. It combines education with a conscious mind on bullying at the student level and even the administrative level to root out that culture of communication by way of school policy, teacher behavior, student behavior, that label values to some and devalues other. And when you combine all things, you get to the apex of this pyramid, which is more, it's counter speech or more speech, which balances proclamations about speech which is protected by the First Amendment. There's certainly a line drawn from an event like the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville to the uptick in hate propaganda today, as reported in that Anti-Defamation League report that I mentioned early on in this talk. So the First Amendment can be balanced by removing hate propaganda and signage when it's found, creating a reporting mechanism in schools that operate on the heels of anti-bullying efforts, to follow up on reports and public statements, to build coalitions among students and educators and board members to help one another speak out. I think all of that gets you to the top of this pyramid. And it gets everybody across ideological bridges, spans liberals and conservatives in the Arlington Public Schools. So I found more speech, not less speech, is a good deterrent to hate speech. It's voices of tolerance working together, so to speak. So as I close here with just a minute left, I just want to say that this position is difficult for me. I even cringe when I think about how reviling speech hurts people from historically marginalized communities. But I finally settled on this position as of late. I've watched calls for book bans in the last 6 months come to fruition in places, and I'm thinking how emotionally charged, value-oriented, and subjective those bans are. That got me thinking about my studies of the civil rights movement. If subjective feelings dictated bans or censorship, then many of those civil rights demonstrations wouldn't have taken place. So I want to leave you with these 4 things. I'll share the PowerPoint, or teachers can screenshot this. But I think these are 4 questions that folks can discuss in the days to come. Why should APS and individual school buildings address contextual uses of slurs? And those are the 3 contextual methods. Discuss why APS leaders fight hate speech with more speech. And discuss what responsibilities should be levied on authority figures and institutions for emboldening hate speech and hate crime. So you're looking at policy there. Okay, and how can APS create school buildings of inclusion and belonging? So with that, I think my time is up. And I want to thank everybody for listening to me, and I hope that I've given you something that will generate discussion among your group. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Mealy. Thank you to our excellent equity and excellence coordinators, specifically Ms. Sherry Benitez at Yorktown High School, for spearheading this phenomenal conversation. Dr. Todd Mealy, again, for highlighting the current climate on debates over free speech and the increase in hate crimes and hate propaganda. I thoroughly appreciated your discussion on solutions for our school division, as we need to focus more on discussing the solutions to the problems. And students, some of you have been fighting to make sure that our student body feels welcome. And I say thank you, and the fight continues. Other students joined the session today, and you know victims, or you have been a victim of hate speech. Your identity, your culture, your traditions, your family values all make up the greatness here at Arlington Public Schools. Our diversity is the beauty of our humanity, and to discount or discredit a person's identity blemishes its beauty. And so as we embrace this season of spring, its brightness and its joy, I charge all students listening to also embrace conversations that connect us, not divide us. I admonish each of you to participate in activities that create a sense of belonging for you and each of your classmates. Some of you have begun those conversations in small circles, and yes, continue doing so. Now, I want to see us all enter into those larger circles with teachers and equity and excellence coordinators to change the negative impact hate speech has had on our community. I appreciate you tuning in today, and I look forward to hearing more from you about ways we confront negative hate speech. And to teachers, thank you for carving out the time today to discuss this conversation with your students. We just ask that you complete the evaluation in Frontline. Everybody have a phenomenal Monday.